I am Hercule Poirot. Welcome to my new mystery story.
It was at precisely 11:30 on a sultry July evening that the great house of Lady Millicent Arkwright became the scene of tragedy. The assembled guests had only just finished their bridge hands in the drawing-room when a scream, piercing, desperate, and unmistakably female, rang through the corridors. For a moment there was stunned silence, the kind of silence that seems to draw breath before it shatters into commotion. Then came the crashing of chairs, hurried footsteps, and the babble of alarmed voices. The source of the outcry was soon discovered. On the second floor of the Arkwright estate lay the crimson bedroom, a chamber so christened for its heavy velvet drapes, the crimson-patterned wallpaper, and the rich carpet that muffled every step. Within that chamber, sprawled grotesquely across the four-poster bed, was the lifeless body of Sir Henry Arkwright, husband to Lady Millicent, and a man whose brusque manner and equally brusque dealings in finance had earned him as many enemies as acquaintances. His face was frozen in an expression of startled disbelief, as though death had taken him mid-sentence. Upon his nightshirt bloomed an unmistakable stain of dark red, blood cruelly vivid against the pale fabric. The windows were locked from within. The door, though bolted only moments before, had been forced open by the servants who had rushed to his aid. No weapon lay in sight. The air itself seemed to quiver with mystery, for there was nothing and yet everything to suggest foul play. Sir Henry had been, so it was said, in the best of health. Only hours earlier he had quarrelled, publicly and bitterly, with his nephew Charles over a disputed inheritance. Whispers spread like wildfire, a locked room, a sudden death, an impossible crime. As the guests gathered, pale-faced and murmuring, Lady Millicent clutched the door-frame to steady herself, her pearls catching the light of the bedside lamp. "Murder," she whispered hoarsely, though no one had yet dared speak the word aloud. "It must be murder." And so began what society would later call the affair at the Crimson Bedroom, a riddle destined to confound police and household alike, until a small, immaculately dressed Belgian gentleman, famed for his little grey cells, arrived to impose order upon chaos. The drawing-room, cheerful an hour earlier, now felt abandoned between acts. Someone had closed the piano. An overturned chair stood upright, leaving a dent in the carpet like a bruise. Lady Millicent sat straight by the unlit grate, Mrs. Dalrymple's hand steady on her sleeve. Finch the butler guarded the door with quiet authority, repeating that no one would depart until the police had finished. Inspector Bullfinch arrived with the village doctor. They viewed the crimson bedroom, the forced door, the locked windows, the bed with its terrible occupant, and returned with expressions that offered no easy path. The doctor spoke of a stoppage of the heart, possibly shock. He would be exact tomorrow. Bullfinch, who preferred problems that yielded to strong fingers, called for statements at once. Only for now. He drew the circle together. There were the guests, Lady Millicent, her nephew by marriage, Charles Arkwright, handsome and bruised by anger, Miss Lydia Herring of the West End, brightness turned careful, Captain Redmayne, courteous, limping, Mr. Felix Mordaunt, solicitor, heavy with discretion, and Miss Eleanor Vale, Sir Henry's secretary, neat to a fault. Of the staff were Finch, Mabel the chambermaid, Carter the chauffeur footman, and Cook, who refused the drawing-room but sent word supper had been punctual and plain. Lady Millicent, voice steady from will alone, stated that Sir Henry had retired early after quarrelling with Charles. He had locked his door, as was his habit when nerves plagued him. She had remained at bridge. Mrs. Dalrymple confirmed it. Charles, pale with defiance, admitted the quarrel. His uncle had threatened to alter his will that very night. He enjoyed scenes, he said, and then, hearing himself, added more quietly, he enjoyed control. Lydia declared she had been in the billiards room with Charles and Captain Redmayne at the time. Both agreed. Mordaunt, smoothing his cuff, admitted he had prepared fresh testamentary papers for Sir Henry to sign in the morning. Routine, he said. He was a man who liked versions. Miss Vale added a small, hard fact. At 10 she had taken up correspondence. Among it lay a letter from the Savoy, marked urgent, by hand. Finch confirmed he had placed the tray outside Sir Henry's door. When Bullfinch sealed the room, no such letter was found. "Very pretty," Bullfinch said, not praising. An absent letter, a bolted door, a scream at a neat quarter hour. He turned to Finch. "You forced the door?" "With the housemaid, sir. The key was within. The chain was on." "Then the trick," said the inspector, "is inside the trick." The bell sounded, discreet and certain. Finch answered it. The gentleman who entered removed his hat as if to spare the house the weight of another unconsidered gesture. "Messieurs, mesdames," he said, hand to breast. "Hercule Poirot. Your constable on the road had the amiability to recall my name. If the inspector is content, I will listen. Later, perhaps, I will put a little order. So long as the order is mine." "But naturally," said Poirot, and took a chair with a view of faces. He requested very gently that each statement be given again in the same order. "A second telling," he explained, "is like a second photograph. The shadows shift and sometimes the object becomes clear." They did as he asked. The shadows did shift. Charles's defiance cracked to reveal bewilderment raw as a torn edge. Lydia's charm faltered at the word Savoy. Calculation flashed and vanished. Redmayne's metallic scrape took on place and time between 10 and 5 past, above the billiards room. Mordaunt's blush, when the will was mentioned, seemed to advertise more embarrassment than guilt. Miss Vale, asked whether Sir Henry suffered headaches, admitted he had taken to darkening the room and locking the door when a headache threatened. Poirot asked one question of his own. Had the servant's bell-board moved? Finch went to see and returned with the board itself in memory. The indicator for the crimson bedroom had trembled at 10:30, then again at 11:15, the minute of the scream. "2 pulls," he said, "but with the door bolted, no one could touch the wire from the corridor." "Not from the corridor," said Poirot, as if agreeing to the weather. He stood. "Inspector, it would oblige me if no one departed tonight, nor, if you please, from his manner. We will keep to our rooms, to our statements, to our own little habits. In the morning I will ask each person for a very small thing, the one detail he has not thought worth the dignity of speech. You shall see, it is the small that undoes the large." Lady Millicent rose with Mrs. Dalrymple's help. "Monsieur Poirot, find the truth and you will find my thanks. Henry was difficult. He was also mine." Poirot bowed without flourish. "Madame, I do not promise comfort. I promise exactitude." They dispersed. The corridor smelt of beeswax and roses. The carpet swallowed sound. Outside, the laurel stirred. Inside, a house that cherished rules discovered that a single, well-placed disorder had taken up residence and, very softly, turned the key. The night pressed heavily upon the house, though every window was closed and locked. Poirot, installed in the small study adjoining the drawing-room, declined rest, declaring with quiet firmness that sleep could wait until order had been imposed upon the first disorder. Inspector Bullfinch, restless and suspicious, lingered in the hall. The servants moved in uneasy silence, as though any footfall might disturb what little equilibrium remained. It was a night not unlike the pause between thunderclaps, when the storm has not quite finished but has withdrawn to gather strength. Poirot, however, was not content with silence. He began, with that patience which others mistook for leisure, to review each account in his mind, testing its symmetry. At the stroke of one, when the house seemed subdued at last, there came a timid rap upon the study door. It was Eleanor Vale, the secretary, pale as the sheet of paper she clutched. She excused herself for the lateness, saying she had remembered a detail and dared not keep it till morning. Poirot gestured her inside with a courtly inclination of the head. She said that Sir Henry, only that morning, had summoned her with instructions to prepare a sealed memorandum to be delivered to his solicitor in the event of his sudden death. He laughed as he said it, she explained, her fingers trembling at the memory. But he was in earnest. I destroyed the draft at his order once it was written clean, and he sealed it with his own hand. He told me Finch would know what to do should anything befall him. Poirot asked where this sealed memorandum was now. Miss Vale could not say, only that she had not seen it among the documents in Sir Henry's writing desk when she tidied them at 10 that night. She begged Poirot not to suspect her for speaking now, for she had feared ridicule if she had told the inspector. Poirot, eyes luminous beneath his arched brows, assured her that fear of ridicule was nothing compared with fear of omission. He dismissed her gently, but when she was gone, he wrote a neat note in his pocket-book. The missing letter from the Savoy, the memorandum of sudden death, the second ringing of the servant's bell. Too many vanishings, mon cher. It is not things that vanish. It is truth that is made to appear absent. He returned the notebook to his pocket and folded his hands in stillness, which for Poirot was as active as any running about. By dawn, the house bore the exhausted quiet of those who had slept little and unwillingly. The crimson curtains in the fateful bedroom remained drawn, though Bullfinch had placed a constable on guard. Poirot, breakfasting on coffee brought discreetly by Finch, took the opportunity to question the butler. Finch's manner was grave but unshaken. Yes, he had known Sir Henry's habit of bolting the door during his headaches. Yes, he had been entrusted with the delivery of private letters. As for the sealed memorandum, he had never handled it. If Sir Henry had made such provision, he had said nothing to his butler. Poirot asked very quietly whether Finch believed Sir Henry had enemies in the house. Finch replied with an answer both loyal and evasive. Sir Henry was a man who did not scruple to speak his mind. That is sometimes enough, sir. At 8:30, Bullfinch reconvened the household in the library. He was determined to plough forward, for his method was to question until a slip betrayed itself. Poirot observed in silence at first, smoothing a crease from his cuff, watching eyes more than words. Charles spoke with resentment undiminished, repeating his grievance over the will. Lydia Herring, seated beside him, pressed her handkerchief with nervous energy, though her story remained unchanged. Captain Redmayne explained again his presence in the billiards-room and grew irritated that his words seemed doubted. Mordaunt, the solicitor, confirmed that Sir Henry had intended to alter his will in the morning and admitted that the new draft was still in his case, untouched. Poirot asked only one question, whether the draft cut Charles from inheritance altogether. Mordaunt flushed and hesitated, but at last admitted it did indeed exclude the nephew. Lady Millicent, upon hearing this, closed her eyes with quiet despair. It was then that Poirot leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Permit me, Inspector, you are thorough, mais oui. But you look for the great gesture, the dramatic blow. Sometimes it is the detail which passes unconsidered that pricks the balloon of lies." He turned his gaze toward Mabel, the chambermaid, who had lingered at the back. Poirot addressed her with courtesy, asking whether she had been the one to carry in the tray of correspondence at 10. Mabel confirmed it, adding she had noticed an envelope unusually thick, with the Savoy's crest. Poirot asked what had become of it. She faltered and admitted she had seen it upon the tray in the corridor outside Sir Henry's room when she went to collect it later, but when she returned, it had vanished. Bullfinch pressed her sharply. Had she taken it? Mabel swore she had not. Poirot, instead of reproach, offered a small smile and said, "You see, Inspector, again the vanishing. It is the same pattern." The weight of suspicion shifted like a current in the room. Charles stirred, muttering that someone was determined to frame him. Lydia leaned forward as if to speak. then thought better of it. Poirot observed them all and rose. For the moment, I ask only that no one quit the house, and that all remain very exact in what they say and do. There is an intelligence in this affair that believes itself clever, and indeed it has arranged much. But cleverness is not the same as order. And Hercule Poirot, he serves only order. Bullfinch grunted, half resentful, half relieved, and dismissed them for the present. The guests dispersed again to their rooms, though unease clung about them like fog. Poirot remained in the library a moment longer, gazing at the shelves. His mind, precise as the ticking of a clock, weighed each contradiction: the sealed door, the vanished letter, the memorandum, the double ring of the bell. The pattern was not yet complete, but already, in his little grey cells, the lines began to converge. He knew that soon the pattern would reveal not only what had happened, but why. For in every crime, Poirot told himself, the act is nothing without the motive. It is the motive that sings the true melody, however discordant the notes. And somewhere within this house, beneath words too rehearsed and faces too carefully arranged, that melody waited to be heard. The morning stretched on with a tension that refused to dissipate, each member of the household moving with a self-conscious restraint, as though afraid that any action might be misconstrued. Poirot, immaculate even after the sleepless night, seated himself at a small writing desk in the library. His neat handwriting filled a page with columns of names, times, and details, each aligned with mathematical precision. Inspector Bullfinch hovered nearby, his impatience barely veiled, as though the quiet scratching of a pen did not constitute investigation. Poirot, however, raised a hand whenever the inspector tried to interrupt, his eyes fixed upon the orderly grid of facts that only he seemed to see. At precisely 10 o'clock, Poirot announced that he wished to walk through the sequence of events from the moment Sir Henry retired until the moment the scream was heard. The group gathered reluctantly in the corridor outside the crimson bedroom, the door still sealed under Bullfinch's orders. Poirot asked each in turn where they had been positioned at 10, at past, and at the hour of discovery. He listened not merely to their words, but to the silences between them, to the glances darted sideways, to the hesitations that betrayed more than speech. When Charles repeated with bitterness that he had been in the billiards room the entire time, Poirot's gaze flicked toward Lydia Herring, whose bright eyes betrayed a sudden tightness at the corners. When Captain Redmayne corroborated the statement, his voice clipped and military, Poirot inclined his head slightly, as if noting that the confirmation was too quick, too precise. Then Poirot made a curious request. He asked Finch to bolt the door of the crimson bedroom from the inside, then to close it behind him with the chain fastened. Finch complied, disappearing into the shadowed room while the others waited with an unease that prickled like static. Moments later, Poirot instructed him to try and pull the servant's bell from within. A faint jangle reached their ears, but the indicator on the board downstairs did not shift. Poirot then had Finch repeat the action, this time placing a small wedge against the chain before pulling. The indicator trembled and fell. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "You see, Inspector, one can manufacture the illusion of time with the smallest of contrivances. A bell that rings later than it was pulled. A door that seems impassably locked, yet was prepared before. It is not the locked door that is the puzzle. It is the illusion of the locked door." Bullfinch muttered but said nothing, while Charles shifted uneasily, as though some foundation of his defense had been weakened. Poirot dismissed the group with a wave, but retained Miss Vale, asking her in the gentlest of tones whether Sir Henry had ever spoken of his trust or distrust toward his nephew. She admitted with hesitation that Sir Henry had grown increasingly irritable toward Charles in recent weeks, accusing him of recklessness and threatening to cut him off. Yet she added something that startled the inspector. Sir Henry had also accused Lydia of undue influence, suggesting she encouraged Charles to spend lavishly, anticipating a share of his inheritance. Lydia, hearing this from the corridor, burst forward, her voice tight with indignation, declaring that Sir Henry had been a cruel man and that his suspicions were poisonous inventions. Poirot merely bowed, neither assenting nor disagreeing, but in his eyes glimmered the satisfaction of a piece falling into place. After lunch, Poirot requested a private audience with Lady Millicent. She received him in the small morning room, her face pale but composed, her pearls absent, her dress simple in mourning. Poirot, with the courtesy of a confessor, asked whether she knew of the memorandum Sir Henry had sealed, the one intended for his solicitor. Lady Millicent sighed, her eyes filling with something that was not quite tears. She admitted she had known of it, though she had not read its contents. Sir Henry had told her only that it was to protect her, should anything untoward occur. Poirot asked if she believed he feared for his life. She hesitated, then whispered that Sir Henry had lately received anonymous notes, letters hinting at vengeance for some past act in business. He had dismissed them, but she had seen his hand tremble once while reading one by the fire. Poirot asked where these notes were now. She spread her hands helplessly. They had vanished from the drawer in which he had kept them. Poirot, concealing his satisfaction, thanked her with grave respect and left her to her solitude. In the corridor, he encountered Mordaunt, the solicitor, his briefcase tucked beneath his arm. Mordaunt requested to speak privately, his manner grave. He confessed that Sir Henry had told him, only a week prior, that he intended to alter his will drastically, not merely to exclude Charles, but to leave the bulk of his fortune to an institution in London. Poirot, arching a brow, asked whether Mordaunt had mentioned this to anyone. The solicitor shook his head, but Poirot noticed a bead of perspiration on his temple, an unpracticed discomfort that suggested more was concealed. He thanked Mordaunt and dismissed him, though his mind noted carefully the increasing web of motives. By late afternoon, Poirot requested that all suspects assemble in the drawing-room once more. He stood at the hearth, his small frame radiating an unexpected authority. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "I thank you for your patience. A man has died. He was rich, yes, he was also formidable. Such men make many enemies, but they also bind those around them with strong ties of dependence. It is in such soil that motives flourish. But remember, motive alone is not crime. Opportunity and method must unite with it, or suspicion is but a shadow. And Hercule Poirot, he is not satisfied with shadows." He paused, letting the silence press upon them, watching as each face betrayed a flicker of unease. Then, with a gesture almost theatrical, he announced that he would request one more conversation with each person, privately, before the night was done. He wished to hear again their smallest details, the ones too trivial for repetition. For, he said softly, it is the trivial that unmasks the grand deception. Bullfinch scowled, but no one dared object. Poirot, bowing, withdrew to the study, leaving behind him a room taut with fear, where every glance carried suspicion and every silence the weight of an unspoken secret. The drawing-room dispersed in uneasy fragments after Poirot's pronouncement, yet the weight of his words lingered. No one dared speak too loudly, as if the very air might betray them. Poirot retreated once more to the study, where the afternoon light slanted across his orderly notes, casting precise shadows that seemed almost to mimic his mind at work. Bullfinch followed reluctantly, demanding to know whether the little Belgian was any closer to naming the culprit. Poirot merely tapped his temple with forefinger and said, "All in good time, my friend. The truth, it is like a clock. One must not only see the hands, but understand the gears behind them. At present, I see many hands, all pointing differently. Soon they will align." The first to be summoned privately was Charles. He entered with a swagger meant to disguise his unease, but his restless movements betrayed him. Poirot asked him, gently but insistently, about the quarrel with Sir Henry. Charles admitted it had been fierce, but denied any intent of violence. "He threatened to disinherit me. Yes, Charles said bitterly. But he had threatened that before. I told him he could do as he liked, though he knew well enough he could not do without me at the firm. I was his right hand in all business matters. Poirot leaned forward, fixing Charles with an unwavering gaze. And yet, monsieur, he prepared to cut you off altogether. That does not suggest confidence in his right hand. Charles flushed, his bravado faltering before muttering that Sir Henry's temper often dictated his threats. Poirot dismissed him politely, though his eyes lingered upon Charles' clenched fist as he departed. Next came Lydia Herring. She entered with her usual poise, though the colour in her cheeks was higher than before. Poirot addressed her with courtesy, remarking upon her quick confirmation of Charles's alibi. Lydia stiffened, then laughed lightly, insisting she had no reason to protect him beyond the truth. Poirot, ever delicate, asked whether her relationship with Charles extended beyond friendship. Lydia's eyes narrowed, but she maintained composure. "We are companions, nothing more," she said, though her tone betrayed the faintest tremor. Poirot inclined his head. "It is curious, mademoiselle. Those who love often betray their feelings when they seek to protect. But those who are indifferent do not trouble themselves with such exact memory." Lydia rose abruptly, declaring she would not be insulted further. Poirot bowed her out with a polite smile, though his mind sharpened around the contradiction. Captain Redmayne followed. He carried himself stiffly, as though braced against suspicion. Poirot asked of the billiards game, the exact timing, the order of shots. Redmayne recounted with soldierly precision, each detail rehearsed. Poirot listened in silence, then asked one small question. Had the French window in the billiards room been open or closed? Redmayne hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying that it had been closed. Poirot thanked him warmly, but when the captain departed, his brows knitted ever so slightly. It was not the answer itself, but the pause that intrigued him, the pause of a man recalling not the event but the story he wished to uphold. Mordaunt, the solicitor, entered with reluctance. His briefcase seemed heavier than it was, as though burdened with secrets. Poirot asked him to recount once again the details of the new will. Mordaunt admitted the bequest to the London institution, though he insisted it was confidential and known only to himself and Sir Henry. Poirot asked, with gentle precision, whether Mordaunt had informed anyone of the change. The solicitor's denial came swiftly, too swiftly, and his eyes shifted toward the window. Poirot observed him keenly, then remarked, "The man of law, he is bound by duty. Yet even the most dutiful may betray without words, by silence, by expression. Be careful, monsieur. Truth and falsehood, they are written not only upon the tongue, but upon the eyes." Mordaunt left in visible discomfort, perspiration beading his brow. Miss Eleanor Vale came next, her demeanor composed, yet weary. Poirot spoke softly, encouraging her to speak freely. She admitted again to drafting the memorandum for Sir Henry, confessing that his words had unsettled her. Poirot asked whether she had noticed anything unusual that evening before his death. After a pause, she recalled that Sir Henry had been unusually insistent upon privacy, forbidding her to enter his room after 10. "He said he wished to be left alone," she murmured, but his tone was almost fearful. Poirot regarded her with compassion, noting carefully this echo of fear. He pressed gently, asking whether she believed Sir Henry truly expected danger. Miss Vale hesitated, then nodded, whispering that she had overheard him muttering about betrayal. Poirot thanked her gravely, assuring her that her honesty might prove vital. Finally, Lady Millicent was brought once more. She entered with quiet dignity, though her eyes betrayed sleepless grief. Poirot asked whether she had seen any sign of the anonymous notes her husband had received. She confessed that one had been burned in the hearth, another misplaced, and a third vanished altogether. Poirot, studying her closely, asked whether Sir Henry had confided in her regarding his enemies. Lady Millicent admitted that he had many, but she did not believe they reached into her own household. Yet, Poirot murmured, it is often in the inner circle, madame, that the serpent coils. To strike from outside is perilous. To strike from within, that is both convenient and deadly. As the interviews concluded, Poirot returned to his notes, each column now filled with contradictions like cracks in a mirror. He saw patterns. The vanished documents, the second pull of the bell, the locked room illusion, the haste with which alibis were affirmed. He closed his notebook gently, as though sealing a delicate mechanism. The household returned to uneasy quiet, but Poirot's mind whirred with exactitude. Somewhere among them was not merely guilt, but calculation, a mind that had prepared every step, and yet, as always, overlooked the one small detail that would betray it. Poirot, seated upright and immaculate, allowed himself the faintest smile. The pattern was nearly complete. One more thread, pulled with care, would unravel the entire design. Poirot sat motionless in the study long after the last of his interviews concluded, his gaze fixed upon the neat lines of his notebook, though his mind roamed far beyond the page. He had listened to every voice, weighed every hesitation, measured each tremor in tone. The house itself seemed complicit in the crime, its bolted doors, its heavy drapes, its corridors that muffled footsteps. Yet even in such a place, Poirot knew order could be restored. He rose at last, straightened the crease of his sleeve, and stepped into the hall where Inspector Bullfinch waited with a look of weary impatience. "Well, monsieur," the inspector grumbled, "have we gained anything by listening to their little stories once more?" Poirot's lips curved in a slight smile. "Patience, my friend. You see chaos, I see a tapestry. The threads, they are tangled, but the pattern begins to show." The afternoon dragged under the strain of watchfulness. None dared leave their rooms for long, and the usual life of the house was suspended. Cook sent up meals that were barely touched. The clinking of cutlery was louder than conversation. Poirot spent his time walking the corridors slowly, pausing before certain doors as if listening to the silence behind them. His small figure moved with deliberation, and though his manner was courteous, there was an undeniable weight in the way his eyes rested upon each person he encountered. It was as if he carried a scale in his mind, measuring them all and finding some wanting. Toward 5 o'clock, a disturbance broke the uneasy calm. Carter, the chauffeur footman, knocked urgently upon Bullfinch's office door, carrying a bundle of papers discovered in the garden shed. Among them, crumpled but still legible, was a fragment of letterhead bearing the crest of the Savoy. The writing was faint, smudged as though half erased, but the words, "cannot be allowed to continue," stood stark upon the page. Bullfinch seized upon it eagerly, declaring it proof of blackmail or threat. But Poirot, examining the paper delicately between finger and thumb, merely raised his brows. "Curious," he murmured, "that a letter so incriminating should choose to hide itself in a shed so near to hand. When evidence presents itself too easily, it is no longer evidence. It is theater." The discovery nonetheless cast a new pall over the household. Charles declared it nonsense. Lydia looked stricken, Redmayne muttered about cowardly threats, and Lady Millicent closed her eyes as though bracing against another blow. Poirot said little, but when Bullfinch began making notes for an arrest, he interposed with quiet firmness. "Non, mon ami. Arrest, now, and you arrest a phantom. We must wait until the true hand reveals itself." Bullfinch scowled, but grudgingly obeyed, for he had learned already that Poirot's objections, however softly spoken, were rarely without consequence. That evening Poirot asked Finch to join him for a walk upon the terrace. The butler's step was measured, his face calm as stone, but Poirot spoke as if they were companions rather than interrogator and witness. He inquired whether Finch had noticed anyone lingering near the garden shed earlier in the day. Finch paused, then admitted that he had seen Mordaunt cross the lawn in that direction not long after breakfast. He had thought little of it at the time. Poirot thanked him gravely, remarking that even a shadow seen at the corner of the eye could be most useful. As they returned indoors, Poirot whispered to himself, "The solicitor, he plays too neat a game. Neatness can be as suspicious as disorder." At dinner, which was held in tense silence, Poirot observed closely. Charles ate little, pushing his plate away with irritation. Lydia spoke scarcely a word, her usual brightness gone. Redmayne drank more heavily than before, his limp exaggerated by the wine. Mordaunt dabbed constantly at his brow, while Miss Vale seemed withdrawn, her hands clasped as though in prayer. Lady Millicent, though pale, remained composed, watching each with a quiet intensity. Poirot himself ate sparingly, but his eyes moved from face to face, noting how they avoided one another's gaze, how each seemed to withdraw into a private fortress of fear. At last, he set down his fork and said gently, "You are all very quiet, but in silence also the truth begins to speak." After dinner, Poirot requested that everyone return to the drawing-room. There, under the glow of the lamps, he addressed them with calm authority. "We have spoken much of motive, yes, and of opportunity. But what we must consider most is psychology. Murder, mes amis, is not merely the act of striking a blow, it is the culmination of temperament, of fear, of greed, of love, or of hatred. A man may lock a door, a woman may vanish a letter, a solicitor may prepare a will. Yet beneath each act lies the same thing, the mind at work. It is there, in the contradictions of the mind, that we find the truth." His words hung in the air, unanswered. Poirot allowed the silence to deepen, then dismissed them once more, promising that the morning would bring clarity. As they dispersed, Bullfinch pulled him aside, demanding to know whether he meant to expose the killer at last. Poirot only smiled. "Tomorrow, mon cher, tomorrow. Tonight let the guilty soul believe it still deceives us. For when the mask is worn too long, it begins to crack." The house retired, but sleep was fitful. Poirot remained awake in his study, arranging his notes with the care of a jeweller setting gems. The vanished memorandum, the false alibis, the misplaced letter, the staged discovery in the shed, all were beads upon the same string. He saw the hand behind them, the mind that believed itself clever enough to weave illusion upon illusion. Poirot leaned back, his eyes gleaming in the lamplight. "It is near," he whispered to himself. "The melody of the crime. It begins to play true. Tomorrow we shall hear it in full." The dawn broke grey and uncertain, the air damp with the promise of rain. The house stirred reluctantly, as though weary of bearing secrets. Poirot had not slept, but he emerged immaculate, his moustaches precise, his eyes alert with that peculiar brightness which comes not from rest, but from the sharpening of thought. Inspector Bullfinch, heavy-eyed and irritable, met him in the corridor. "If you mean to do your grand revelation today," he growled, "then by God make it quick. I'm not fond of watching an entire household unravel while you polish your phrases." Poirot inclined his head with serene patience. "But of course, my friend. Quickness is admired, but exactitude, that is the true virtue. This morning, the matter will advance." At breakfast, the atmosphere was strained beyond civility. Charles muttered into his coffee. Lydia toyed with her toast. Redmayne sat stiffly with a glass of water, while Mordaunt scarcely touched his food. Miss Vale kept her eyes down, and Lady Millicent, though composed, betrayed the slightest tremor in her hand as she lifted her cup. Poirot sat among them, a quiet centre amid their disquiet, speaking little but watching everything. At last he rose, declaring that he required each of them in the library within the hour. There, he said, would begin the final arrangement of details, for already he had seen enough to know the hand that struck Sir Henry down. A murmur rippled through the table. Eyes darted, suspicions grew sharper, yet none dared refuse. One by one they entered the library, where Poirot stood near the great oak desk, his notebook open before him. Bullfinch loomed by the fireplace, arms folded, though even he seemed caught in the tension that hummed through the room. Poirot began with gentleness, recapitulating the known facts: the locked door, the scream, the vanished letter from the Savoy, the memorandum prepared for sudden death, the curious ringing of the servant's bell, and the crumpled fragment discovered in the shed. "These things," he said softly, "are not the scattered pebbles they appear to be. They are placed with intention to lead the eye astray. We must ask, who benefits most when suspicion falls here, there, and everywhere, so long as it never rests in the true place?" He turned his gaze upon Charles, who stiffened. Poirot noted that the young man's quarrel with Sir Henry was genuine, his anger real, but the very obviousness of his motive made him less likely. "A man who shouts his fury before witnesses," Poirot remarked, "is often less dangerous than the one who whispers in silence." Charles bristled, but Lydia, seated beside him, leaned forward as though to shield him, her face pale. Poirot's eyes rested upon her next. He spoke of her quick confirmation of Charles' alibi, of Sir Henry's suspicion that she drained his nephew's purse, of her agitation whenever the will was mentioned. Lydia's voice trembled as she insisted she had nothing to gain from Sir Henry's death, except freedom from his cruelty. Poirot inclined his head politely, but did not answer. Captain Redmayne was addressed next. His alibi, too neat, had the ring of rehearsal, Poirot observed. The hesitation before answering whether the window was open, that small pause betrayed a mind that was calculating, not remembering. Redmayne protested indignantly, his hand trembling on the arm of his chair, yet Poirot moved on without pressing further, leaving the seed of unease to grow. When he spoke of Mordaunt, Poirot's tone became sharper. The solicitor, he knows all secrets. He alone was entrusted with the will, with the drafts, with the confidences of Sir Henry. He admitted that Sir Henry planned to disinherit his nephew and leave his fortune to an institution. Such knowledge is dangerous, both for those who lose and those who keep. Mordaunt flushed crimson, protesting that he was bound by duty, yet the sheen of sweat upon his brow betrayed more than words. Miss Vale was questioned last, and here Poirot's voice softened once more. He spoke of her devotion, her honesty, her careful memory. "You feared ridicule, mademoiselle, and so delayed in speaking of the memorandum. But you did not destroy the truth. You preserved it in your conscience. Such loyalty is not of guilt, but of burden." The secretary lowered her eyes, and for the first time the room seemed to breathe with a touch of relief. Poirot allowed the silence to deepen until it pressed upon them all. Then, with sudden decision, he drew a folded handkerchief from his pocket and placed it on the desk. Upon it lay a small brass wedge, no larger than a coin. Gasps broke the hush. Poirot explained in quiet tones how such a wedge could be placed against the chain of a door, pulled tight from within before leaving, and left in such a way that the chain would seem fastened when in truth it was only propped. "It is a trick, messieurs et mesdames, a trick to create the illusion of an impossible room. And such a wedge I found, concealed in the seam of the curtains of the crimson bedroom." Bullfinch swore under his breath, while several faces blanched. "The murderer believed himself clever, yes," Poirot continued. "He sought to confuse us with locked doors, missing letters, vanished memoranda, even a false trail in the garden shed. But cleverness without order, it collapses. Each trick, it points to the same hand, a hand too precise, too orderly, too intent upon deception. It is not the hot-headed nephew, nor the frivolous lady, nor the blustering soldier. It is the one who lives by papers, by secrets, by concealments." His eyes turned upon Mordaunt, who sat rigid, his knuckles white upon the arm of his chair. A collective murmur swept the room, and Mordaunt's lips parted as though to protest. Yet no words came. Poirot raised his hand. "Patience, monsieur. I do not yet reveal all, but know this, the net is closing. One final detail remains, and when it is in my hand, there will be no escape." He closed his notebook with a decisive snap. The room trembled with the weight of his words. Bullfinch exhaled heavily. Lady Millicent pressed a handkerchief to her lips. Charles muttered under his breath, and Lydia looked away. Poirot, serene amid the storm, merely bowed. "Tomorrow, mes amis, we shall gather once more, and I will set the matter in perfect order. Tonight the guilty may tremble. Tomorrow the truth will stand." The library emptied with an air of strained disbelief, each figure withdrawing into the privacy of their chamber as though walls alone could protect them from suspicion. Mordaunt lingered longest, his lips pressed thin, his eyes flicking from Poirot to Bullfinch as if searching for some escape. But at last he departed without a word. Poirot remained by the hearth, hands folded neatly upon his notebook, his expression calm yet intent, as though his mind worked far ahead of the present hour. Bullfinch, restless as ever, broke the silence with a low growl. "You've all but named him, and yet you let him walk away. Why? He'll bolt before morning." Poirot smiled faintly. "No, my good inspector, he will not bolt. The guilty man, he clings to the theatre of his lies. He wishes to watch his own play to the end. If he fled now, the curtain would fall unfinished. No, he will remain." The storm that had threatened all day finally broke after nightfall. Rain lashed the windows, thunder rolled above, and the wind moaned through the chimneys, unsettling the household further. Poirot dined sparingly, and then withdrew once more to the study. He instructed Finch to ensure that no one left their quarters, and requested Bullfinch to station constables at the main entrances. "Not for their safety," Poirot explained softly, "but for their temptation. When a man feels the walls close, he longs to test the door. If the door resists him, he becomes desperate, and in desperation, mon ami, lies confession." The hours crept forward. Poirot sat alone with his notes, the lamplight steady upon his tidy columns. Each contradiction he had unearthed, each hesitation he had heard, each misplaced document he had traced. They converged like tributaries to a single river. Yet even as the pattern revealed itself, Poirot knew that one last strand must be tested. He rose at midnight and slipped into the corridor, his footsteps noiseless on the carpet. He paused outside the crimson bedroom, now sealed and guarded, and stood with his head slightly bowed, as though listening. After a long moment he turned away, satisfied not with what he heard, but with what he did not hear. At 1 o'clock, a sudden clatter broke the uneasy stillness. A door slammed somewhere on the upper floor, followed by hurried footsteps. Bullfinch, roused from his vigil in the hall, thundered up the staircase with constables at his heels. Poirot followed more slowly, his expression grave yet unsurprised. They found Mordaunt in the passage, dishevelled, his briefcase clutched to his chest. He stammered that he had been unable to sleep, that he had wished to review certain papers to ease his mind. Bullfinch seized the case and forced it open. Inside lay the testamentary drafts, as expected, but also a bundle of letters bound with twine. Among them, unmistakably, were the anonymous notes Lady Millicent had described, along with the very memorandum Miss Vale had spoken of. Gasps echoed down the corridor, as the truth seemed to declare itself. Bullfinch's hand closed like a vice upon Mordaunt's arm. "That's enough for me. You're coming to the station." But Poirot intervened, his voice sharp yet calm. "Gently, Inspector, too gently, perhaps. For this, it is not yet finished." He took the bundle of letters, leafed through them with delicate fingers, and drew out the memorandum. His eyes narrowed as he read the neat, compact script. "Curieux," he murmured, "that Sir Henry should write of fearing betrayal from within, and yet entrust the memorandum to the very betrayer. Too neat, too arranged. This is not the hand of the victim. It is the hand of the forger." His gaze lifted, and for an instant it rested not on Mordaunt, but upon the others who had gathered in the commotion. Charles, Lydia, Redmayne, Lady Millicent, Miss Vale. Their faces reflected astonishment, fear, denial. Poirot folded the papers and returned them to Bullfinch. "Keep them safe. They will be the final piece, but not in the way you imagine." Mordaunt protested his innocence, his voice high with desperation. He claimed he had found the letters hidden in Sir Henry's desk and had only taken them to protect his client's reputation. He swore he had not forged anything, that he was the victim of a plot. Poirot listened without expression, then turned away, murmuring only, "The truth, it waits until morning. We shall see then whose hand has written lies." The household returned to its uneasy silence, though the storm outside raged with renewed fury. Poirot remained awake, pacing the study with slow, measured steps, his mind weaving together the threads with final precision. He thought of the locked door and the wedge, of the vanished Savoy letter, of the memorandum now so conveniently discovered, of the solicitor's knowledge, of Charles's quarrel, Lydia's fear, Redmayne's hesitation, Lady Millicent's grief, Miss Vale's burden. Each had played a part, yet only one hand had orchestrated the illusion entire. Poirot smiled faintly, not with triumph, but with certainty. The web was complete. In the morning, before them all, he would cut through the lies and reveal the truth with the clarity of a blade. The rain ceased toward dawn, leaving the air heavy and still. Poirot stood at the window, gazing at the drenched lawns glistening in the first grey light. Behind him, the house stirred fitfully, unaware that the moment of reckoning had arrived. He adjusted his cuffs, straightened his moustaches, and whispered to himself with quiet satisfaction, "It is time." The morning gathered itself in silence, broken only by the cautious creak of footsteps and the subdued clatter of breakfast trays carried along the corridors. No one lingered long at table. The guests assembled with reluctance in the drawing-room, their expressions taut with dread. They knew Poirot had promised to conclude the matter, and each in their own way feared the unveiling of the mask. Lady Millicent sat upright on the sofa, her composure steady but her eyes shadowed with grief. Charles leaned against the mantelpiece, arms folded, jaw clenched. Lydia remained close to him, though her face betrayed sleepless anxiety. Redmayne stood apart, rigid as a soldier on guard, while Miss Vale kept to a chair by the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Mordaunt, pallid and sweating, paced the carpet like a man walking the length of his own cell. Bullfinch loomed in the background, gruff and impatient, yet unwilling to interrupt what he sensed was the final act. Poirot entered without haste, every line of his appearance exact, from the gleam of his shoes to the perfection of his tie. He paused at the doorway, surveying them all as though placing each piece on a chessboard. Then, with a slight bow, he advanced to the center of the room and rested his hand upon the back of a chair. His voice, quiet yet resonant, commanded the attention of all. "Mesdames et messieurs, the time has come. You have been patient, some willingly, others less so. But now Hercule Poirot will put the matter in order. A man lies dead, and his death was not the work of chance. It was planned with cunning, carried out with precision, and cloaked with falsehood. Yet, as always, the truth reveals itself when one applies the method of order and logic." He began by recounting the facts as they first appeared. Sir Henry locked in the crimson bedroom, the scream that drew them all, the door forced, the body found lifeless. "It seemed an impossibility," Poirot said softly, "for the room was secured from within, yet impossibility, it is only the disguise of ignorance. With the little wedge, concealed in the curtains, the illusion of the bolted door was created. That detail alone tells us the murderer had prepared long in advance, and preparation, that is not the act of sudden passion, but of cold intention." He turned his gaze upon Charles, whose scowl deepened. "You, monsieur, had motive in abundance. You quarreled violently with your uncle, You feared disinheritance, you despised his control, yet your anger was too loud, too visible. Would a man so reckless then contrive such a delicate deception? No, your hands are too blunt for this. Charles muttered an oath, but said nothing more. Poirot's eyes moved to Lydia. You, mademoiselle, were suspected by Sir Henry of influencing Charles to squander his money. You stood to lose much if his inheritance vanished. Yet your instinct was to protect, not to destroy. Your fear was genuine, but it was the fear of suspicion, not of guilt. Lydia bowed her head, relief and shame mingling in her expression. Poirot then addressed Redmayne. You, Captain, offered an alibi too precise, too rehearsed. You hesitated when I asked of the window. Yet your deception was not born of murder, but of pride. You wished to shield yourself from humiliation. You had fallen asleep, n'est-ce pas, during the billiards game and feared it would be seen as weakness. But weakness is not crime. Redmayne flushed crimson but gave a stiff nod, acknowledging the truth of the charge without protest. His eyes shifted at last to Mordaunt. And you, monsieur, are the man of papers, of drafts, of wills, of letters. The discovery in the shed, the bundle in your case, the memorandum so neatly prepared. These were your weapons, not of steel, but of ink. Yet here lies your failure, in your very neatness. You wished to scatter suspicion everywhere, yet in scattering you revealed the hand that held the sieve. Only you had knowledge of the will, only you had access to the drafts, only you could forge the handwriting with such ease. You believed that by placing false evidence you would direct suspicion to others, but each forgery bore the same flaw. It was too careful, too deliberate. Sir Henry's true hand trembled, but the false letters did not. In perfection, monsieur, you betrayed yourself. Mordaunt staggered back, his face grey. He stammered protests, claiming innocence, declaring that he had merely sought to protect his client's affairs. Poirot raised a hand, silencing him. No, monsieur, you sought to protect yourself. Sir Henry had decided not only to disinherit Charles, but to alter his affairs in a way that threatened your own position. You feared exposure of mismanagement, perhaps even of theft. And so you contrived his death. You entered the room under pretense of delivering papers. You struck him swiftly. You placed the wedge to create the illusion of the locked door, and you arranged the letters to mislead. It was a crime of calculation, of vanity, of too much cleverness. Bullfinch stepped forward, his heavy hand gripping Mordaunt's shoulder, but Poirot continued, his voice softer now. Yet there is more. You might have escaped had you not sought to overplay your part. The memorandum of sudden death, that was your masterpiece, was it not? But it was written too smoothly, too perfectly, lacking the small inconsistencies of Sir Henry's natural hand. Miss Vale, who typed his letters daily, confirmed to me that certain phrases were not his. And that, monsieur, was your undoing. The forgery that was meant to bind suspicion upon others bound it upon yourself. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Lady Millicent pressed her handkerchief to her lips, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Charles muttered fiercely that he had known all along it was a plot, while Lydia gripped his arm in trembling relief. Redmayne stood straighter, as though released from a burden. Miss Vale closed her eyes, whispering a prayer of thanks. Mordaunt, pale and broken, collapsed into a chair, his protests dissolved into incoherent mutterings. Bullfinch, grim and resolute, signaled to his men to take him away. Poirot watched in silence as the solicitor was led from the room, his figure sagging like a marionette with its strings cut. When the door closed behind them, Poirot turned to the others with a bow. Thus the order is restored. Sir Henry Arkwright is avenged, not by force, but by logic. The truth, mes amis, is always there, waiting for the eye that will see it. And with that, he adjusted his cuffs, the faintest glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes, as though the harmony of the world, momentarily disturbed, had been set right once more. The hush that followed Mordaunt's removal was heavy, as though the house itself held its breath after a storm. Rain still dripped from the eaves outside, the rhythm steady and low, like the last echo of thunder. Lady Millicent sat very still upon the sofa, her handkerchief crushed in her fingers, her eyes fixed upon Poirot as if seeking some final assurance that the horror had truly ended. Charles stood by the fireplace, his head bowed, the fierce energy that had carried him through days of suspicion suddenly drained. Lydia remained beside him, her gaze shifting constantly, as if the safety of her future hung still by a thread. Redmayne's rigid posture softened at last. He exhaled deeply, his shoulders lowering as though freed from a soldier's burden. Miss Vale sat quietly, her expression a mixture of sorrow and release, the pallor of sleepless nights still upon her face. Poirot alone appeared untouched by the turbulence, his every detail immaculate, his moustaches perfect, his expression serene. He clasped his hands lightly before him and spoke with gentle gravity. "It is finished, mes amis. The guilty has been named, the order restored. Yet I know that in each of your hearts there lingers unease, questions that demand answers. Permit me, then, to put before you the truth entire, so that no shadow may remain." He moved slowly across the room, his voice calm, each word deliberate. Sir Henry Arkwright was not an easy man. He held power firmly in his hand and wielded it without mercy. To his nephew he was a tyrant. To his wife he was difficult yet beloved. To his companions and associates he was formidable and feared. Such men do not live without creating enmity. But his death was not born of a sudden quarrel or a moment's passion. It was conceived long before, in the mind of one who lived by secrecy. Mordaunt, the solicitor, feared the exposure of his mismanagement, the ruin of his reputation, the loss of his place. He crafted illusions to confound us. Locked doors, vanished letters, forged memoranda. He believed himself too clever, but as I have told you, cleverness is not order, and without order, deception collapses. His eyes rested on Lady Millicent. "You, madame, mourn sincerely. You have lost a husband, difficult though he may have been. You feared the anonymous notes, and rightly so, for they were crafted by Mordaunt to weaken your courage. Yet you showed dignity, and now you may grieve in peace." She inclined her head, tears shining but unfallen, her voice breaking as she whispered her thanks. Poirot then turned to Charles. "You, monsieur, though your quarrel was fierce, were innocent of the deed. Let this serve as lesson. Anger is dangerous, not because it leads always to crime, but because it blinds others to your innocence. Learn from this, and perhaps one day you will be the man your uncle believed you could not be." Charles muttered a low reply, gratitude hidden beneath defiance, while Lydia pressed his hand quietly. Poirot's gaze shifted to Redmayne. "And you, Captain, feared that your weakness would be seen. You lied to protect your pride, not to conceal guilt. That was foolish, yes, but human. Pride, like anger, can entangle the innocent in suspicion. Take comfort, you are free." Redmayne bowed his head slightly, his voice low as he thanked Poirot with the brevity of a soldier. Lastly, Poirot turned to Miss Vale. "Mademoiselle, you carried the burden of truth with courage. You feared ridicule, you feared that you might be drawn into suspicion, yet you spoke when it mattered. It is not easy to confess the small detail others dismiss. Yet it is precisely such detail that builds the truth. Remember always, the small things are the great." Miss Vale's lips trembled, but her eyes shone with relief. Bullfinch, who had listened with folded arms, now stepped forward, his voice gruff but tinged with respect. "Well, Poirot, I'll grant you this. You see further than most. I'd have hauled the nephew in and congratulated myself, but you waited. You built it like a puzzle, and you cracked it clean. I may not follow your little grey cells, but I can salute the result." Poirot inclined his head with modest courtesy. "Merci, Inspector. We each serve justice in our way. Yours is the strength of the arm, mine the precision of the mind. Both are necessary. The atmosphere softened. Tension gave way to weary relief, as though a knot had been untied. The storm outside dwindled to a misting drizzle, the dawn light pale but steady. The household, fractured by suspicion, seemed at last to breathe again. Yet Poirot, though calm, did not indulge in triumph. He walked to the window, gazing out upon the drenched gardens, his reflection pale upon the glass. "It is always the same," he said quietly. "One man's ambition, one man's vanity. It destroys peace for all. The crime is solved, yes, but the wound remains. Sir Henry lies dead, and nothing I can do will restore him to those who loved him." Lady Millicent rose slowly and came to stand beside him. "You have given me at least the truth," she said softly, "and that is more than comfort. It is dignity." He would not have wished to be remembered in falsehood. Poirot bowed, his voice tender. "Madame, the truth is the only tribute worthy of the dead." When at last the constables departed with their prisoner, and the household began to settle into the weary rhythm of aftermath, Poirot gathered his hat and cane. He turned to Bullfinch with a final smile. "And now, my friend, Hercule Poirot will take his leave. The case, it is closed. I will trouble you no more." Bullfinch grunted his acknowledgment, though his eyes betrayed reluctant admiration. The others offered thanks in murmurs, subdued by exhaustion. Poirot accepted them with grace, then stepped out into the damp morning air. The lawns stretched before him, silvered with dew, the sky clearing after the storm. He walked with steady step toward the waiting car, his small figure neat against the vastness of the estate. At the door he paused, glanced once more at the house where tragedy had unfolded, and spoke softly to himself. "Always, it is the same. The vanity of men, the folly of pride, the hunger for wealth, they play the same notes again and again. But the little grey cells, they listen for the true melody beneath the noise. And so order is restored." With that, he entered the car, and as it drove away down the glistening avenue, Hercule Poirot closed his eyes, the faintest smile upon his lips, content in the harmony of justice regained. The great house slowly resumed its rhythm, though it would never be quite the same. Servants polished silver with a quieter hand. Footsteps moved more carefully across the carpets, and the air held a trace of memory that could not be banished with time. Lady Millicent retired to her sister's estate in Bath, carrying with her a dignity burnished by sorrow. Charles and Lydia departed together, chastened, their laughter muted, their future uncertain, yet bound by a bond tested in suspicion. Captain Redmayne returned to London, shoulders squared, as though determined to prove that a soldier's honour could endure beyond scandal. Miss Vale, free of burden at last, accepted a new post in the city, her quiet strength recognized by those who valued precision and loyalty. Inspector Bullfinch, though gruff as ever, spoke with respect whenever Poirot's name was mentioned, grudgingly admitting that sometimes the mind unravelled what brute force could not. As for Poirot, he lingered but one night longer in the countryside before returning to London. The newspapers, already abuzz with the locked room mystery at Arkwright Manor, clamoured for interviews, yet Poirot declined them all. To him, notoriety was of no importance. The truth alone mattered. He sat instead in the quiet of his compartment on the morning train, the countryside streaming past, his hands folded neatly over his cane. His thoughts returned not to the triumph of exposing Mordaunt, but to the strange fragility of human ambition. A man of letters and law, Mordaunt had believed himself invincible, his crimes concealed beneath neatness and paper. Yet in his very striving for perfection, he had betrayed himself, for true humanity lies always in imperfection. Poirot, with a faint smile, thought again of the wedge hidden in the curtains. Such a small device, yet one that unraveled the illusion entire. "It is always the small detail," he murmured, "the overlooked thread that, when pulled, undoes the grand tapestry." The train rocked gently, soothing as a cradle. Poirot reflected upon the others, the innocent caught in suspicion's snare. Each had been forced to confront a weakness, anger, pride, fear, dependence. None were guilty of murder, yet each had felt the weight of accusation. And perhaps that was its own kind of justice, for in the glare of suspicion, men and women see themselves most clearly. Poirot did not pity them. He believed in facing one's truth, however uncomfortable. Still, he felt compassion, for human hearts were fragile instruments too easily led astray by vanity, greed, or fear. As the train drew nearer to London, Poirot straightened his cuffs and adjusted his moustaches with care. The case of the crimson bedroom was finished, consigned now to memory, but it would not fade quickly. He knew that in drawing rooms and dinner parties, whispers would persist, the locked door, the vanished letter, the solicitor's disgrace. Yet for Poirot, the matter was closed. Order had been restored, justice satisfied, and the melody of truth had been heard clearly at last. He allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction, not of triumph, but of harmony regained. When the train slowed into the station, Poirot rose, collected his valise, and stepped onto the platform with the same precise dignity he carried into every investigation. To the casual observer, he was but a small, dapper man with curious moustaches and meticulous manners. Yet within him, the little grey cells hummed with the knowledge that once again, deception had been conquered by logic, chaos subdued by order. He paused before the bustle of the city, breathed deeply, and whispered with a hint of irony and tenderness, "Ah, but humanity, it never ceases to astonish." Then, with cane tapping smartly against the stone, Hercule Poirot walked forward,